Piano fingering is one of the most crucial aspects of learning the instrument, yet it's also among the most overlooked. Early on in my own piano studies, I managed to come up with some pretty odd contortions of the hands as I tried to solve problems of fingering. Thankfully, my teachers were really helpful at showing me more natural fingerings that resulted in a better sound. As a preface, let's start with a rule of thumb that's something of an exception to all the other rules of fingering. And we'll call this rule 0. Finger it out for yourself. Now, your hands are uniquely yours. What's perfectly comfortable for me might actually be unplayable for you. So if you have small hands, for instance, you might need to find a very different solution to playing a challenging passage than someone with larger hands. And by the way, there are plenty of great players with small hands. It's therefore a good idea to come up with your own piano fingerings rather than, say, rely blindly on the editor's fingerings. Fingerings are also ultimately inseparable from interpretation, and the editor likely chose fingerings that achieved his or her desired touch. So you may well hear the music differently, and often different fingerings would better suit how you hear the music. Now, there is an exception, and that might be the composer's own fingerings, but these are generally pretty rare, and they sometimes apply just to the instrument that was used at the time. So maybe the composer wrote this for a forte piano, in other words, a historical piano that's very different from the modern one, or maybe the composer wrote it for a harpsichord, so they might not work as well on a modern piano. And this is why I sometimes recommend unfingered sheet music editions. Yet in any case, editorial fingerings are very often a helpful starting point. Just make sure that they fit your hands and match your desired articulation. There's no need to be shy about changing editorial fingerings if you find a solution that suits you better. Now, that said, it is important to play by the rules. So good piano fingering is based on the natural shape of the hand. Generally, what's most natural is also most comfortable, and what's most comfortable sounds the best as well. Ultimately, the goal of fingering should be to achieve the most beautiful and effective sound possible in the most natural and comfortable way possible. So here are 7 essential rules to help you achieve just that. Rule number 1, the natural hand position. The first rule of piano fingering is that the shorter fingers play the longer keys and the longer fingers play the shorter keys. So the shorter fingers are the thumb and the pinky fingers 1 and 5, and these play the longer keys, namely the white keys, and then the longer fingers are the index, middle, and ring fingers, fingers 2, 3, and 4, and then these play the black keys. So this is a piano fingering rule, and it's exemplified by the natural hand position. So in this position, fingers 2, 3, and 4, the longer fingers that are in the middle, they just rest on this group of 3 black keys, F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. And then fingers 1 and 5 are on white keys. I use E and C. Now, Chopin always started his students with a slightly modified version of this hand position. So he just used B in place of C, because with this, then he could teach the B major scale. So he could teach this as a hand position. Now, this means that in general, it's most natural to use the middle fingers, fingers 2, 3, and 4 for the black keys. A corollary of this rule is that the thumb is usually, but by no means always, it usually avoids playing the black keys. Rule number 2, scales. One of the reasons it's so essential to know all of your piano scales is so you can play the piano with the most natural and effective fingering. When reading piano music, our fingers need to know where to go. And since so much of music that we play is based on scales, knowing all of our scales without ever having to think about the proper fingering is really an enormous head start. So in other words, you could practice your scales and know them so well that you don't have to think anymore consciously of exactly what the fingering is for that scale. You just know because you've done it so many times. In general, you want to play scale passages with the same fingering that you use when playing those scales alone. There are plenty of exceptions to this rule, by the way, so we don't want to simply stick to this rule slavishly, but that's probably the first thing that we'll try in general. Rule number 3, arpeggios. Just like with scales, it's essential to learn the standard fingerings for our arpeggios, also referred to as broken chords. So we don't want to just learn, let's say, the chords in root position. right? We'll want to learn the inversions as well, and so on. Rule number 4, symmetrical fingering. And the hands are mirror images of one another. If they're moving in opposite directions, like opposite direction arpeggios, then it's far more natural to change hand position at the same time in both hands, if possible. And it's easier to remember passages in which the thumbs coincide, for example. So if we were doing this, and then both the thumbs play at the same time, then it's actually easier to remember passages like that. So this rule should generally not override the rule of scales. So scales in contrary motion do need to retain their proper fingerings. Rule number 5. Use a consistent fingering for repeated motives. If a motive or figuration is repeated in a different key, it's often best to keep a consistent fingering, even if it sometimes means breaking other rules. Particularly in fast passages, a sudden change from, say, 1-2 to 2-1, it can actually disrupt the fingering pattern, and it could sometimes lead to mistakes. So if you maintain consistent piano fingering for repeated motives, sometimes it means a less natural fingering, but it aids the memory. Rule number 6, 5 fingers, 5 colors. Now Chopin taught that each finger had its own color. Changing our fingering for a given passage can subtly and sometimes dramatically affect the resulting sounds. So try this passage, for example, with the logical fingering 3-2-1, 3-2-1. And now try the same thing with 4-3-2, 4-3-2. And do you hear and feel the difference? So if you do 3-2-1, it might be more articulate, but if you do 4-3-2, it's a subtle difference, but you feel it and it will sound a little bit different. So it's only fair to point out that not all pianists agree with Chopin's notion of making use of the different properties of each finger for achieving different tone colors. So now, starting in the 19th century, an ideal arose among some teachers to try to equalize all 5 fingers of each hand. Now, it's certainly possible and also desirable to strengthen weaker fingers, but the fingers can never really achieve true equality. And I should mention that any piano exercises to this end should really be done only in a healthy manner, with the careful guidance of an experienced teacher. So you definitely don't want to injure yourself here. But be creative with your fingering. Well, in general, you should finger in a way that maximizes control, ease, and efficiency. Sometimes an inefficient fingering will turn out to be more expressive. Rule number 7, write down your fingerings. Too many pianists consider writing in their fingerings to be a mere beginner's crutch, and something that players should really graduate from once they reach a certain level. Yet writing down your fingerings is really one of the most helpful of memory aids, and it ensures that we're consistent in our fingering during our practice. Now, the first thing I do after sight reading a new piece of music is write in my fingerings. Now, I'm not entirely pedantic. My goal is just to be able to look at any measure and then know right away which finger plays which note. So I therefore don't need to write in every last fingering, but instead, wherever there's any ambiguity, then I write in the fingering in that place. Now there is an exception, and this exception is very intricate music such as fugues, where playing just one note with a different finger can risk derailing a performance. Try putting these 7 fundamental rules of piano fingering into practice, and I'm confident you'll soon be surprised by just how much they help you progress in your studies. Happy practicing.